We are recording. Yeah, I've been on a bit of a podcast hiatus recently. So this is the first podcast I've recorded in probably over a month. So I'm really happy to have you here, Turner. This is great. I'll talk about the chair and how we got in touch and all that in the intro that I'll record later. So we don't have to do that now. But I'm sitting on one of your chairs right now. You'll notice me sort of rocking around, as are
Me
you.
too.
um, yeah, it's interesting. I don't promote things on the podcast. That I've been doing this
Yeah.
podcast for over a decade now, and there have been times when I did ads and tried to find ways to monetize it, and I just sort of get disgusted with myself every time and stop it. But occasionally when I find someone who's doing something that's really interesting and worthwhile, I've got no qualms about it if it's something I actually like and believe in, whether it's a
Yeah,
book
and
or a
I'm I'm
chair.
I'm I'm very uncomfortable pitching our chairs. That's what my 20-something crowd does. I'm more interested in the idea of active sitting, and I
Right.
try and stay clear of chair pitching.
Well, I really appreciate, one of the things I appreciate about the way you're going about this is the button chair. So you do this chair based on your experience as a orthopedic surgeon. Is that correct?
I was a general surgeon. I'm triple boarded in general surgery, trauma surgery, and burn surgery and critical care. I at one
Wow.
point I was quadruple boarded, and this business of getting involved with sitting is just like the last thing on my list ever. Um, but I kind of aged out of staying up all night with gunshot wounds, and
Mm,
so I slid over into doing epidemiology because I have a degree in math and statistics, biostat kind of epidemiologic modeling. And so I started doing that, and so I was sitting a lot, and for the first time in my life, my back hurt. I thought, what the?
mm,
So one thing led to another and it got out of hand, and so pretty soon I'm making prototypes,
right,
and before you know it, you're in for $1 million worth of prototyping madness. and
right.
then and then your son comes home from getting his degree in computational biology at Cornell, and he's just like horrified that I've pissed away his entire inheritance on this vanity project. And, and so he's very eager to put this on like a business-like footing.
Uh-huh.
so, so it's a push-pull kind of thing.
Yeah, you think if your dad's a doctor, you're all set, right? I mean, come on.
And not just his dad, his mom is a rheumatologist,
Oh,
so he's like, we kind of thought he'd go to medical school, and I think he kind of thought he would, but after watching his parents, for decades, he decided the doctoring thing was a lot of damn work. So,
yeah.
yeah, so the business of trying to find some other way forward, and entrepreneurship kind of tickles us, scratches an itch that he has.
Well, let me get into or just finish the point I was starting to make there about the button chair, because it reinforces the idea that you're doing this out of your interest in active sitting and something beyond just trying to introduce a new product into the marketplace and make some money. The button chair is a set of instructions, digital instructions that you guys send out free to schools around the world, who can make their own chairs very similar to the ones that you sell on your website for free, basically, for some plywood, and if they have the right tools, they can print it up for free. So it's kind of like
Right,
you're
and
sharing the code. It's a very
it's
cool
been
thing to do.
it's been downloaded 4,000 times,
Mm,
and I just love the idea of, it's like stuffing a button share through the internet because it's just a digital file that pops up and pops out in Singapore or Taiwan or Germany, and anybody with a CNC router can just like cut the pieces out like a cookie cutter. And then um, the joints are designed so they just fit together. You don't need screws or glue or anything. It just like pops together. And It was just kind of, I wonder how this will go kind of thing. But we had one guy whose wife, well, a teacher in one of the schools in Essex, Vermont, close by, has a husband who has a wood shop with a CNC router, and she demanded that he make 100 button chairs. So he did, and it worked out pretty well in this school here in Vermont. And now we've got high schoolers kind of researching button chairs in grade schools in Virginia and North Carolina. So I love the idea that older kids, high school kids, are doing research on younger kids using button chairs that is kind of the test dose of active sitting, which is, basically free because that way you need a CNC router and some plywood, but other than that, it's free.
Yeah, tennis ball. Yeah, yeah, it's awesome.
This is a button chair. We call it a button because it kind of looks like a button. Also, we like the double entendre butt on chair because kids like that.
Nice.
we we
On chair.
started the original design used a tennis ball, but we found out that kids could wear through a tennis ball in less than 2 weeks. So we switched to lacrosse balls, and they can't wear those out.
Mm.
And the rest of it is, just plywood that's, cut with a CNC router.
So for those of you watching this on video, you just saw the button chair. What is the website where people can go and look at this stuff?
It's buttonchairs.org, BUTTONCHAIRS, no space, .org.
And what's your main site for selling the commercial chairs?
And we have it's QOR360.com, like core, only all the C's were taken. So we got the Q's, QOR360.com.
All right, cool, cool. I was watching your TEDx video this morning uh, for the second time, and I'll link to that in the episode description so people can see that if they'd like. But you said something that really resonated with me. It was just a line. It was a transitional line. You said you were talking about office chairs and how they support your lumbars and your back and your neck and your this and your that and all the other stuff. And you said, but we aren't being supported. We're being confined and restrained. And I wanted to like stand up and applaud. I thought that's my whole message too, right? About civilization, about industrial food, agriculture, about the medical system. Everything is saying we're making you safer, or the way we raise children, right? Like, oh, don't touch that, don't step on that, don't move over there. We're not making people safer, we're weakening
We
them.
Oh, your goddamn shoes, right? Your feet are being like boxed in, and you're and anesthetized by the pillowy insoles that let you feel nothing.
Yeah,
Your foot's designed to interact with the whole planet, and it's anesthetized and compressed. And when when they did this to Chinese women a couple of centuries ago, everyone was horrified by the foot binding just to make people, stumble around. And we're right back with it. It's astonishing what people have put up with. All in the
yeah.
all being assured that this is all for your benefit and comfort. I think comfort's been way oversold.
Well, I think I wrote about this in Civilized to Death, but I had an experience where I was visiting friends, and they said, in the guest house, they said, well, we just installed a new bed there. Be interested to hear what you think about it. It's this very expensive natural latex noodles from the Amazon, and they told me about the thread count and this and that. And these are really wonderful people. And I don't mean to be, ridiculing them at all. It's just, they're just generous and kind. So they were like, hey, we got this beautiful bed for the guest house. So I went to bed and I fell asleep, and I woke up in the morning and we were having breakfast, and they said, what do you think of the new mattress? And I said, I honestly, I didn't even notice. I just fell asleep and woke up, and I guess that's good, right? I mean, like, is that what you're supposed to do? And that got me thinking, like, what is the difference between numbness and comfort, right? What is that? It's the lack of sensation. We're confusing lack of input, of awareness, with comfort, which is kind of a death wish, right? I mean, when you're dead, you don't feel anything. When you're alive, sort of by definition, you're dealing with input, sensory input, experiences, challenges, you're engaged. And yet it seems like we're constantly reconfiguring our environment in order to eliminate these inputs. It's a very
Right.
strange thing.
No, and as you say, being alive is a matter of interacting with the world, feeling the world. And whether what you feel is comfortable or uncomfortable, that's something that's really added on at the cerebral level. Your sensory system is just reporting information. Your brain decides if it likes it or not. So
Yeah.
it's a very nuanced thing, but you can find expensive chairs on the web, 5, 6, 7 grand that really look more like beds. People are reclined and padded in every conceivable way so that they can feel nothing, which is as you say, it feels like a death wish, really. It's odd.
You'll hear people say, it's so comfortable. I felt like I was floating on a cloud. It's like, that's such a weird thing to say. I'm floating. I felt nothing.
But
That's your
but
def.
we're designed to live in gravity.
Right.
So when a newborn is born, it doesn't have the normal lumbar lordosis and spinal curves. These develop as a matter of existing in gravity and creeping, crawling, toddling, and walking. I'm quite certain, although the experiment hasn't been done, and I don't think any IRB would approve it, that if you raised an infant in zero gravity, you would wind up with um, a spine that wouldn't work when you got back to Earth
Right. Yeah. Well,
because the spine develops in a gravitational field, expecting a gravitational field. And when you
mhm.
just get to the zero G floating slump, this is not a useful posture if you're existing in a world with gravity.
Expecting is a very interesting word to use there. And I think that is a window into so much of these issues, right? The body does expect things. There's a problem with sleep apnea and crowding of the teeth and all sorts of dental and throat issues because the jaw of children expects to chew hard foods. And because it doesn't encounter hard foods, because we feed babies mush, basically, the jaw doesn't grow enough. And so we end up with underdeveloped jaw bones, which crowd the teeth, which mean your wisdom teeth are impacted, which means your throat doesn't function properly, cascading problems with health because the body's not receiving what it expects. And
And
we
it
can,
and it breaks your heart as a parent to know that you've done this to your child.
yeah,
and
I,
and
I
and
agree.
and there and there are other examples. Half of the world that wears spectacles now, 100% of the current group, and it's going to be 75% within another 20 or 50 years. And the medical profession was stymied by this for a long time because it makes no sense that you'd have a perfect organism and then it would just die in the wild because it couldn't see or
Yeah,
couldn't see accurately enough. And now we think we understand that it's because we live indoors and
right.
we never exercise our eyes by looking at a horizon that's distant, and we don't get and the sunlight is filtered through glass, so the eye doesn't develop in a way that normally would give us 20/20 vision, as all hunter gatherers have.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
we're hobbled in so many ways.
And when you talk about being a parent, I'm not a parent. I never had kids, and one of the reasons I never had kids is I have always felt um, opposed to the mainstream teaching on how to live, and so I felt like, how can I have kids who are going to school with everyone else, and they think Santa Claus is real, and I'm saying that's a bunch of bullshit, and then that ruins their lives and their friendships, and I just didn't want to get into that whole mess. Um, but one of the things that comes up quite often is this whole thing about let your kid cry it out. Put your kid alone and just let them cry and cry and cry until they give up, and then everything's going to be wonderful. And looking at this from an anthropological perspective, or a primatological perspective, a primate infant left alone in the dark of night is an infant that's about to be dead, right? That's very deep in our instinct. And, any baby knows that. So, this idea that you put a kid alone in a dark room and just let him cry it out, like, I can't imagine the trauma. And I'm not blaming parents for this because that's what they're taught to do. But it's
Right, and
weird.
it's trauma for the child, but it's also trauma for the parent because
Yes.
every parent knows in some deep way that this is a terrible thing to be doing to a child, especially your child.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of parents who, quietly begin co-sleeping, just put the baby in bed with them and don't talk about it because it's forbidden. I have an MD, my wife has an MD, so we're very happy just throwing the kid in bed with us for years. And that bullshit about, oh, you're going to roll over and crush your child. No, you aren't. That's just deep silliness. You know where your child is every moment because they're touching your skin. So
Yeah, although
I-
I
you know,
mean, what if someone's an alcoholic and they're so drunk they don't know where they are? You're right. I mean,
so so
that's the problem. It's like we make up these rules to the lowest common denominator, and the rest of us are trying to follow the rules, but it doesn't make sense, for most people.
Right. So for most people, co-sleeping is the obvious thing to do. And when I say most people, I mean all of humans through time. There's a lot of humans
Yeah,
out there.
exactly. Most people from a anthropological perspective. So you studied, and did you study anthropology formally, or is it just a lifelong interest? I know
Oh,
there's a
I
lot going on there.
so when I was an undergraduate at Princeton, I was a university scholar, so you could take any course you wanted. You just had to be able to like write a thesis before you left. So
Mm,
I took a lot of anthropology because I just thought it would be such a great life,
mm.
being an anthropologist. But I don't know, neurobiology kind of got a hold of me, and then I wound up in medical school. So you just don't. It's hard to plan.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. So tell me about Princeton. What years are we talking about? Or 70s?
No, yeah, the 60s.
Oh,
I was a class of 73. When I arrived at Princeton, I'd been there for a couple of weeks, 1741 hall, and I asked the guy in the room next to me, "Yeah, Don, where are the girls?" And he just burst out laughing because Princeton was a boys' school. My mother didn't tell me.
no kidding.
so so
Wow.
but it was an interesting anthropologic experience because they introduced women while I was there, but it was a odd circumstance with thousands of men and a few hundred women. That
Mm.
it was just it was an odd time.
So you started your freshman
um
year was 69 then?
it's 60.
A lot's going on. You're you're a teenager. Vietnam's happening. The lunar program is underway. The first Earth Day, and that was a
my
tumultuous
dad
time.
my dad my dad is a naval officer. We're marching on Washington, D.C., about the war in Vietnam. I come home with a bunch of my long-haired hippie friends to our family home in Arlington, Virginia, and my parents politely put them up, and then we go, kind of rebel against everything that my dad's career had stood for. These were not tense, but you know, difficult times. My dad couldn't imagine that you know the things that happened in Vietnam were happening, and it wasn't until my brother came back from Vietnam and said, "Oh no, it's not that bad. It's worse." And my poor dad, he had a lot of adjusting to do. So these were heady times, and as you say, the space program and all it was an exciting time to be alive.
Were you aware, and people around you, were you aware of how special that historical moment was that you were living through?
um, I knew that landing on the moon was uh, was unusual. I was on I was on an archaeology dig in Winchester, England, and I really wanted to be present for that moment, but I was living in a dorm someplace. So I just found the tourist section of London and walked along till I got to an open window and could listen to somebody else's television when we landed on the moon. It was really it was a transformative moment for me.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting that what you said about your father. I kind of had the same experience with my father. He worked in public relations, and he kind of believed in the transformative potential of a well-run corporation, and and by the time I was growing up, uh, it seemed pretty clear to me that corporations were, by their very nature, anti-human. The profit motive trumps everything else. And for a while, that was sort of the struggle, father son struggle that we had. And eventually, like your father, he saw enough and heard from enough people and came to the conclusion that I was right, that it actually was irredeemably corrupt as an entity. And that was really sad. It was like, to see someone whose sort of motivation was pure, and see them come to the conclusion that they'd been wrong. It's
Or
something.
they'd been wronged. They had been misled.
Yeah, yeah, good way to put it. But it was heartbreaking. It's like, that's an argument I wish I hadn't won. And I wonder, for you as a physician, if there may have been some similarities in your professional trajectory. You did a lot of surgery over the years. I'm sure you're familiar with John Sarno's work.
Mhm.
And I think he felt the same, that it's like, I did a lot of surgery that actually what these people needed was psychotherapy, or they needed movement education, or they needed better furniture, or they needed, their marriage needed work. It wasn't about the spine. This anxiety manifested in the spine, but it wasn't actually a structural issue.
Right. My training was as a general surgeon initially. So we were doing these operations for women with breast cancer where we would do not just mastectomies, but we do extended mastectomies where we take the pectoralis major and the pectoralis minor. Even we would take ribs out, trying to get deep to the cancer to be sure we got it all. And then this was our training. This was what skilled surgeons were teaching us to do. And in fact, not too many decades later, we learned that breast cancer is a systemic disease from the moment it's detected. And
Hmm.
all of this um, heroic um, surgery we were doing wasn't heroic at all. It was mutilated. And, you know, it, you feel terrible to have participated in something like that, but we didn't know any better. So you don't get a pass, but you do get the obligation to understand clearly what you're doing before you dive in, especially if it's an operation that you can't undo. Um, so yeah, no, it's a medicine is it keeps a hard school because well, as they said, half laughingly when I was in medical school, half of what we're teaching you is wrong. We just don't know which half.
Yeah,
And it's
yeah.
yeah,
What
no,
do you think about
and
the personality of a surgeon? Does this I've spent a lot of time around doctors, and each specialty sort of has its cliche. It's almost like um horoscopes. There's the surgeon personality, there's the psychiatrist personality. Is
well,
that kind?
I love this little one-liner. You can always tell a surgeon. You can't tell him much, but you can always tell a surgeon.
Yeah, exactly.
Or
There's the kind of
and
the
and
go ahead. Go ahead.
and my wife is an internist, so we have this surgeon internist kind of tension going on all the time.
All
The
right.
most famous internist of the 20th century was Sir William Osler, no relation to me, um, and he has a whole book of aphorisms. And my favorite of all of them goes like this: He says, "There is scarcely any condition so grave that it cannot be made worse by surgery."
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and surgery, combined with a medical system that encourages intervention over prevention.
Or profit driven, for crying out loud.
Yeah.
It's a prescription for catastrophe.
Yeah. Yeah. I was married for a long time to a psychiatrist, but we lived in Europe, so it's a very different set of motivations and incentives there. And it's just interesting to see, how different. Like, no one becomes a doctor in Europe to get rich. You know, that's not a motivation at all.
No, and it's new in the United States. Up until the 1950s, doctors were paid like plumbers.
Mm,
It wasn't until, in the 60s and 70s that doctors started to have fancier cars. And then it really got out of hand.
and is that sort of congruent with the rise of specialization?
Um, Boy, it would be an interesting thing to try and figure out. Certainly, in the 50s, there was no reason to pay a doctor very much because they couldn't do very much. They had aspirin and penicillin, and they could get your appendix out reliably most of the time. So, and as medicine became more accomplished, we can read we can rejigger your heart so that you don't have chest pain and you don't die of an MI. We can all of a sudden, doctors are doing stuff that made a much bigger difference in people's lives. But I think what really happened was somebody went to business school and said, wait a minute, wait a minute. You guys could be making a lot of money if you just got yourself organized.
Mm,
And now, I read venture capital groups are buying up hospitals in cities. You know, and as you alluded to, as soon as a corporation's motive is just to make more money, um, it's not going to go well for the consumer. And when the profit motive is how medicine is structured, it's been a catastrophe.
yeah.
Um, I always my career was spent in academics, so I just got a salary from the university and operated on anybody I thought would profit from an operation. There's no motive to do more. So that kind of medical model where you put your physicians on a salary and you get the profit motive out of the whole game, I think would make a big difference. But it's not going to be easy to get there in the United States. It's it's a problem.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an entrenched problem, and then you add the food and the inactivity, and it's just like the entire approach to life in the US is sort of anti-health. It must be devastating
Right.
from your perspective.
And we've systemically miseducated consumers. So, oh, you have pain, you must need a pill. And if that's the approach, you're going to have disappointed consumers, but you're going to sell a lot of pills.
Right.
Um, when the real answer is, you need to change the way you're living. That's a heavier lift for most people, and most people just don't want to hear it because
Yeah.
a pill would be easier.
And isn't that's again, and we keep hitting on these things that sort of reflect in many different directions, right? Like spirituality, people looking for contentment and peace and love, and the answer is almost always you need to change the way you're living. But people don't want to hear that. So no, just give money to this guru or do these exercises or get this surgery or take this pill. It's It's
Yeah,
always the
for a
same.
long time, my career was quite blinkered, because I was a trauma surgeon. So people come in with a gunshot wound, and it's simple. We're going to go to the OR and we're going to stop the bleeding and sew up the holes and get you to the ICU. It's a very simple algorithm, and it's not about changing the life you live until you pull back the focus and say, "How's it come you got shot anyway?"
Yeah.
you know, and and uh, and usually there's people don't usually get shot for praying too loud in church. Bad joke. But sometimes you get shot in church these days.
Mm,
Um,
yeah, that's true.
but it's it's a choice that we've made as individuals and as a society to make gunshot wounds a part of our lives. How crazy is that?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and now and now we've decided, oh, really, it's a public health problem. And once you reconfigure the problem in that way, you might be able to make some progress. I spent a lot of time on the problem of gun violence. That's one of my research interests. And boy, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, it's going to be a hard problem to solve. But as you, I'm sure, have heard, gunshot wounds are the leading cause of death in children in the United States.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know, man. I lived in Spain for over 20 years. And so I feel like a foreigner in the US in many ways. And I see these issues that we're talking about, and I don't want to be a downer. I know, you know, hope is important, but it just feels like they're so systemic, whether we're talking about industrial agriculture or we're talking about miseducating people on how to move and how to inhabit their bodies, or it's just like it's so systemic, it's so baked into the cake at this point. I
Where do
don't
you
know
even
how.
start?
Yeah,
Where do you even start?
it feels like we need some sort of a major revolution and then start over. I just don't see how to. It's like sometimes a manuscript is so bad that no amount of editing is ever going to fix it.
Written a few of those myself, I have.
So have I. So have I. Okay, so let me push back a little bit on something you said in your TEDx talk. You're holding the spine and you say this is a masterpiece of human evolution. And I know much less about this than you do, obviously, but I look at the spine, as most of the things in evolution, as a patching over patches over patches over patches, as opposed to a masterpiece, right? Um,
Mhm.
so to me, it looks more like, okay, this was not meant to be vertical. This was meant to be horizontal, right? So the origins of the spine were in lemurs, I would think.
Well, the spine has to do both, of course, because you have to begin by crawling. So the spine has to support crawling, and it
Mm,
has to support toddling, and it has to support upright posture. I mean, it has to do all of those things. And it's interesting that the spine can kind of evolve in the course of months to become a different structural element. So I'd say it's part of the brilliance of the spine that it can kind of, well, the expression ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. You kind of go through being a fish and so the spine goes through, some crawling animal to some standing animal in the course of the early months and years of a child's life. Um, and and this is absolutely required because the business of walk, I mean, it takes a kid a year to learn how to walk. Why does that take so long? Is the child lazy or stupid? What's the deal? And the deal is walking is very hard.
mm,
There's a lot of machinery to keep upright and moving without falling down. And in order to get all that to work, you have to program the whole nervous system. And you do that by letting the child explore its environment. And, kids go through a series of maneuvers that they learn over weeks and months and the first year of life that culminate in upright walking posture. They teach themselves to walk by merely interacting with the world. It's brilliant.
Mm,
Um, and the spine goes right along with the whole thing, changing its contours and configuration until finally it supports upright posture. So I would say that, you know, it's even more brilliant than it seems. It's
mm,
and when you get down to the facet joints in the spine, they're oriented in an anterior posterior direction, so the lumbar spine flexes AP but not laterally, and then you get to the thorax and you get rotation because the facet joints have just rotated about 45 degrees. You don't see this until you take a spine with your hands and start twisting an articulated spine and start twisting and playing with it. It really is brilliant. It is incredible.
what do you think about yoga?
So, yoga is I've done, a few years of yoga in the past, and it's certainly good exercise, and you get more limber. But the history of yoga is, not at all what what we call yoga in the United States. We have competition yoga in the United States, which no yogi in India would recognize that as a concept. It's a yoga comes
Yeah.
from the Sanskrit word for yoke, as in like yoking oxen together. So it's connecting you to the sublime, infinite universe. It's about spiritual development. It's not about touching your toes, at least in its original configuration. Um, so I've gotten a lot of good out of yoga because it's made me more flexible and stronger. But I kind of have a feeling it's drifted a long way from where it started, as everything that comes to America does. Everything gets reinvented in a way that the people who invented it would not recognize. Pizza, I'm sure, it seems odd to the Italians.
We put cheese in the crust in America. Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking about yoga when you were talking about the different ways that the spine articulates and doesn't articulate. I was thinking about, how many yoga teachers are just pushing for greater mobility and flexibility without really understanding the skeletal constraints of the body.
Right. And you see these people who have extreme flexibility, and you think, boy, that's cool. But years down the road, they also have arthritis. So just it's not necessarily the case that these extreme practices are healthful. Um, you know, we say that exercise is like the best drug ever. I mean, it basically makes everything better. And so as a doctor, you'd like to be able to write a prescription for exercise because it's hard to get people to actually do exercise. Um, but if you think of exercise as a wonder drug, is there such a thing as an overdose?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It is the case that in medicine we say all drugs are poisons. It's just a matter of the dosage. We now know that extreme cardiovascular athletes, the super long distance cross country skiers and stuff like that, wind up having heart difficulties later in life. So you can push the machinery out of its design envelope, and it can cause problem with joints. It can cause problems with cardiovascular health. So yeah, Hippocrates, I think, got it right when he said, moderation in all things.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yeah. Yeah. I was talking about this with Joe Rogan last time I was on his show. He was sort of joking about the fact that like I'm one of his only friends who doesn't like work out a lot and have big muscles and all that. And I said to him, like, first of all, there are a million places I'd rather be than a gym. Like, it stinks. It's full of like dudes I don't really want to hang out with. It's just not my
and it's
scene.
and it's boring.
It's boring as fuck. I mean, do you know the origin of the what's it called? The belt that you run on, the
The treadmill.
treadmill. Do you know the origin of the treadmill?
Well, I did a little research dive on it, and my understanding is that the treadmill actually got its start, 500 BC maybe, when people were walking on a water wheel to irrigate crops
Oh, geez, I didn't know
in
that.
Egypt. Well, there's kind of the form frust of a treadmill. It converts human lower extremity work into useful work by
Mm,
turning a shaft.
right.
So that was kind of the beginnings of the treadmill, and it had different incarnations over time to produce energy. And then we had horses, so trying to get people to crank out calories and watts just wasn't as useful. But it came back into service in the 1800s when it was used in prisons as a
That's
punishment
right. That's what I
because
was thinking of.
it was a soul crushing punishment because there was no end. You just kept trudging
And you're not
along, and
accomplishing anything. You're just
it was worse than solitary confinement. And now,
yeah.
people, want one for their basement. Although I expect most of them are just a place where they hang their workout gear and
Yeah.
gathers dust.
Yeah.
I,
Uh, it just
and you perhaps know this story, but 'cause it was Lieberman, I think, guy at Harvard took a treadmill out into the bush and to try and measure the cardiovascular fitness of the Hadza, the hunter gatherers out in Tanzania. And so they get this thing on a Land Rover and they get it all the way out into the bush and they hook it up with batteries and stuff to get it to work. And the Hadza will not get on it. They think we don't see the point. Why would anybody do that?
yeah.
Yeah, and the poor researcher is really crestfallen. It's a lot of work to get a treadmill working out in the bush, and then to have your subjects just refuse. I
Yeah.
mean, but that was a teachable moment. The Hadza have much to teach us, and refusing to get on a treadmill is one of those teachable moments.
For sure. Yeah, I was lucky enough to hang out with the Huts last year. I was in Tanzania for a while, and I have a friend who you may have actually heard of. He is a researcher in the microbiome,
Mhm.
and he spent a lot of time with the Hadza studying their diet and their microbiome, digestive. And he just sort of not with any research intention, just for his own personal interest, he took some Hadza fecal material and mixed it up and shot it up his ass to see if he could cultivate a hunter gatherer microbiome in his own gut.
Mhm.
And I guess he told someone the story, and the story spread, and next thing you know, it's like in the New York Times, and it became this big thing. And it kind of messed up his career for a while. But anyway,
Well,
he hooked us up, and we spent some time with them. There was a lot of fun.
the whole business of self-experimentation has a long history. There's a great book entitled Who Goes First, where, when you're going to do some crazy ass thing, you know, typically, at least historically, doctors would involve their wives.
Mm. And children sometimes,
and, and children.
like Skinner boxes.
It's really quite something. But uh, a guy who was interested in the infectious etiology of duodenal ulcers.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, I
um,
he
yeah, you
drank
know
it,
that
right?
story. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. So drank it and developed duodenal ulcers, proving his point. But he just about couldn't eradicate the stuff. I mean, you have to be careful with the self experimentation because you can pick up interesting parasites that you probably wish you didn't have. So it's heroic to try
yeah.
to copy somebody's biome.
Well, and medical research is so difficult to budge, or I should say, medical insights or conclusions or whatever. You have to do something as dramatic as drink the bacteria at a medical conference in front of 500 people and say, check in with me in 3 months and we'll find out if I'm right or wrong. I don't know if you know about this, but I think one of the most heroic examples of what you're talking about I'm aware of is in the late well, in the 50s up until the early 60s, LSD was marketed to physicians, particularly psychiatrists, as a psychotomimetic. In other words, it was something that doctors would take in order to experience psychosis so that they could better understand their patients.
That's an interesting view.
Yeah. I mean, it turns out LSD probably doesn't mimic the experience of psychosis all that well, so that's sort of discredited from a medical perspective. But the idea that as a psychiatrist intending and to with a compassion for your patients who have lost touch with reality, that you can take this substance and for 6 or 7 hours lose touch with consensus reality, and that's going to make you a better doctor. That's an amazing thing.
It's an amazing thing, but it's also commonplace. There's nothing like a doctor getting cancer to make him much more sympathetic with patients who have cancer. Suddenly you understand what it's like to, you know, be waiting with bated breath for the next biopsy in a way that, you thought you understood, but until you experience it, you don't.
Yeah.
I haven't had that particular experience, but I've been a doctor taking care of back pain and wondering why these people are, moaning and carrying on when there's nothing wrong with their x-ray. And I got back pain, and I now understand why these people are carrying on. It really hurts.
Yeah.
It makes you a
Isn't
lot more sympathetic.
isn't pain an interesting phenomenon though? Because getting back to what you said earlier, how the sensations come in and then we interpret them. So anxiety and excitement are exactly the same from a neurobiological perspective, right?
Mhm. It's all about
Pain,
context.
yeah. Like if we I wrote a chapter in a medical textbook years ago about pain, and I opened by describing a dream in which you step on a piece of jagged glass and it cuts into your foot. You feel pain when that happens in your dream. Your body experiences pain. Your heart rate goes up, there are hormonal releases. The body is going through the experience of pain, and yet nothing actually happened to you. Conversely, people can burn themselves under hypnosis and not feel any pain at all. So it's
Or
it's
people
very
can
interesting.
be gunshot in battle and carry on, and only later notice, blood running down their leg or whatever. It's a it's a it's a it's a wiring system that has lots of checks and balances and overrides built into it. Um, and when you think about it, the human organism is arguably the most, or one of the most complex objects in the universe. And yet, it doesn't have an owner's manual. You just start driving. And so how is that even possible? And the answer is pain. Pain lets you know when you're doing something wrong. And crucially, if you say break a rib, um, pain lets you know when it's healed and you're ready to go again. So it's a very exquisitely tuned onboard diagnostic system that lets you control a very complicated machine without even being able to read or write, right? Every pre-literate society does just as well. And in fact,
Better.
bonobos and chimps and roundworms, they all have pain to modulate their behavior to keep them safe. So and just to prove the point, some people are born with some neurocircuitry that's missing and aren't able to feel pain, and their lives are terrible
Yeah.
because they can't tell when they're stubbing their toe or burning their hand, and it's a nightmare.
And
So
getting back to
so pain
griping,
pain is your pain is your friend.
right, as is pleasure,
As
right?
is pleasure. Yes.
And yet, getting back to griping about modern society, one of the things that we teach kids is to ignore the voice of the body, to be ashamed of the pleasure, to ignore the pain, no pain, no gain, fight through it, walk it off, go to the gym and do all this boring nonsense so you can have big muscles to impress other guys, because most women don't give a shit about your muscles, dudes. Sorry to break it to you. Like this, it seems it's like putting the kid in the dark room and saying, cry it out. We just do that to ourselves over and over again until we get to the point where we can't hear the voice of our body.
Yeah,
in
no,
terms
and
of diet and exercise and movement? Like what is the best exercise from your medical perspective? If you were going to prescribe exercise, what would you suggest people do?
oh, I think it's different for different people and certainly different stages in their lives. Two things I'd say is that um, the best exercise is one that you'll do.
Mm,
It has to be something that you find engaging or fun or uplifting or amusing or it has to be something that you want to do or else it's not likely to happen. Um, as a baseline, though, Hippocrates said that walking is man's best medicine.
yeah.
So we know that the human body is really designed to walk miles a day as hunter gatherers. We can run when necessary, but walking is our preferred, most efficient gait. Um, and so we're our bio milieu interior is programmed to expect that level of biochemical effort of walking. So it's really well tuned to our health and longevity. Um, walking I think is the thing I'd pick first. But if you like doing martial arts or swimming or gymnastics or whatever, terrific. But
Yeah.
something that you find engaging is really the key to lifelong pursuit. And that will change. I started out, doing competition judo in college, and I moved on to aikido, which is like a kind of a flowing martial art. And then as getting thrown around gets harder as you get into your 70s, Tai Chi is looking better and better.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about Aikido. I saw on your website that you mention Aikido as one of the sources of information in designing the chairs and your approach to things. I also studied Aikido for a few
Really?
years.
What?
Yeah, yeah. And I well, here's my Aikido story. I was in graduate school and I went to a class that was about drug abuse and alcohol addiction and addictions in general. And I was an adult student. I was in my probably late 30s at the time. And I had done a lot of research about psychedelics and ethnobotany and the way different cultures interact with different psychotropic substances. And so I was in a position where I probably knew more about this than the teacher, so I was thinking, oh boy, this is going to be difficult because this teacher is going to be spouting a bunch of mainstream nonsense about how all drugs are bad and blah blah blah, and I'm going to be faced with either be true to myself by disputing some of this or just shut up and let it happen. Anyway, first day of class, I go in and this guy is awesome. And he's way ahead of me and he knows everything I know and then some. And it was just such a wonderful experience. And at one point, he said, as therapists, a lot of people who come to you are coming against their will. They're coming because the wife said, if you don't see someone, we're getting divorced. Or the
Mhm.
judge says, if you don't go into therapy, you're going to prison or whatever. And so they're coming to you with all this aggressive, resistant energy, and you can't let that affect you. You need to maintain your center and find a way to use this energy to help them. And I raised my hand, and I had studied Kung Fu and karate when I was younger. And I said to him, that sounds like Aikido, right? And he said, oh, yeah, come to me after class and let's talk about this. So I went after class and he said, look, I've studied Aikido for 20 years and it's been more helpful for me as a psychotherapist than any graduate school, any book, any Jung, Freud, any of that stuff. And he said, if you want to do this, I would really encourage you to study Aikido. And here's the name of my teacher in San Francisco. And I said, well, I don't have any money. I'm going into debt just to do this grad school. And he's like, well, just go. The first class is always free and meet the guy and see what happens. So I went to the class and his name was Richard Moon, this teacher. And The class was awesome. It was fantastic. And after class, he said, "What do you think? You going to come back?" And I said, "Look, I'd love to, but I don't have any money. I'm in grad school. I'm working at a nonprofit. I just can't afford whatever." And he said, "Look, classes are $10 a class. Come to class as much as you want. Keep track of it. When you have money someday, send it to me. And if you can't find me, give it to somebody who needs it." And I thought, that's Aikido, right? He's living this perspective. And so that won me over. And then I continued studying with him for a while, and then in Barcelona for years after.
No, and it's Aikido is not just about maintaining your equilibrium in a psychologic sense, but also in a physical sense. Um, I, I sometimes I'm only Shodan. I'm only first degree black belt, but I sometimes teach at our dojo when nobody else is available. And I say, Aikido is just about your posture gets better and better, and your opponent's posture gets worse and worse until he falls down. It's
Mm,
just a matter of staying being in a balanced position so you can move back. You can move in any direction without effort or preparation. This is what Aikido is, and it's also the way you want to stand and the way you want to sit is to be perfectly balanced so you can move in any direction. And our Aikido dojo really embraced the whole idea of active sitting because it's just so much about being balanced in every direction.
mm, yeah. Yeah. I really love Aikido. I think it's not the martial art I would choose if I were in a fight, but it's the martial art that I would choose to avoid getting into a fight.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so here's a story. I couldn't never find time to do Aikido myself because I was like a busy surgeon saving lives. But when my kid got to be 6 years old, I was trying to teach him a judo roll, and he kept doing somersaults. And I thought, surely there's somebody in Burlington, Vermont, who can teach him how to roll. So we go to an Aikido class, and it's the kids are just ricocheting off the walls, terrific. And my kid immediately gets it, and I get signed up for the kids class just because they need, the kids like throw big people around, so it's fun for everybody. My kid gets to the first day of middle school, and he's like under a tree reading a book with some of his friends at lunchtime, and some big kids come by and says, "This is our tree, you have to leave." And my son and his two friends say, "Whoa, no, we're just reading a book." And then they grab one of my son's friends and throw him down against a basketball hoop, and he's lying down crying. And then they grab the next son's other friend and throw him against the tree, and he falls down crying. And my son is just standing there looking at him. And they stop and they leave. Um, I don't know what would have happened, but it doesn't matter. It's just how you stand and how you look.
Mm,
Um, then they got the teacher involved, and the badly behaving children were forbidden to have recess for the rest of the year. But you know, avoiding conflict is really so much more useful than
yeah.
making a big deal out of it.
Yeah.
And and being ready for the next step is really all it takes.
Yeah.
You don't really need the next step.
Earlier when you were talking about how babies learn to walk, and what a complicated process that is, the balance and the different brain systems, and so many things are happening. I was thinking of a book called The Song Lines. Do you know that book by Bruce Chatwin?
I don't think I do.
Very interesting, interesting anthropological book. So many different reasons. It's interesting. Um, the song lines are the sort of walking prayer of
Mhm.
Aboriginal Australian cultures. The book's very much about walking. And I was thinking how I wonder if babies that gestate in a woman who is herself walking feel that rhythm, and that helps them in the process of learning to walk themselves.
Mhm.
Whereas babies who are, in utero, in women who are not walking, who are just sort of hanging around in Western culture, if that has an effect on the development of the baby's brain or recognition of rhythm or what have you.
I'm sure it's true because we know that babies recognize their mother's voice immediately they exit the womb into the world because they've been listening to it through the abdominal wall. So the tiny brain inside the uterus it's not like on pause. It's recording constantly.
Yeah.
So I'm sure that the business of being inside of a living, breathing, walking individual makes a difference. I'm sure that that's true. Um, and we know that learning to walk is complicated because roboticists, when they want to teach a robot to walk, have found that it's much better to let the robot explore the world and develop its own way of walking than it is to try and program a robot to walk.
That's
There's
interesting.
a guy here at the University of Vermont, Josh Bongard, in the Department of Engineering, but I think he's got joint appointments in the Department of Mathematics. He's brilliant, and he's invented robotic starfish that are programmed just to flop around, but they keep track of if they're making progress toward where they're supposed to go. And if some flopping motion gets them closer, they do more of that. And if some
Mm.
flopping motion doesn't, they do less of that. And before you know it, the starfish are like moving uh, through the world with a gait that you could never have imagined yourself. It's just, and what is absolutely cool about it is Bongard then like rips off one of the legs. So the starfish, is like one leg down and it learns how to limp and get around anyway. Just as a human who's learned to walk, if something happens, sprains an ankle, it suddenly switches their gait to some gait that lets them continue to get around by having constant feedback from the world. So by having this deeply ingrained self-taught kind of motivation through the world, um, allows people to on the fly switch it up when needed. It's a very robust system of motion rather than having a right leg forward, left leg forward kind of robotic shuffle, which wouldn't serve you well if when the hyenas come for you. You need
When that sounds like the title of a book, when the hyenas come for you, you better be ready. Oh man. Hey, Turner, thank you so much. Dr. Turner Osler. I should not be so casual.
well,
Um,
I'm still board certified, but I haven't done an honest day's work in the operating room for a decade. So I'm not.
no, once I have a lot of respect for medical doctors. As I said, I lived for 20 years with Casilda as a psychiatrist, and she before she did her residency in psychiatry, she worked in Mozambique during a war, and she amputated limbs and delivered babies and transfused her own blood into somebody who was dying, and like she's heroic. And so when people call me doctor with my little PhD, I just feel so ridiculous.
Well, the word doctor doesn't have anything to do with sutures or aspirin or anything, right? I mean, it means teacher.
Mm,
Um, and
right.
that's legit. That's
Yeah.
legit.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, I mean, despite all the everything working against medical doctors, the systems and the profit motives and the this and the that, I still think there's something deeply generous and decent about anyone who chooses to do that with their
No,
lives.
I just love working with medical students, because they show up for the right reason. It's a very it's I just love working with them.
Yeah. Well, listen, thank you for your work. And I hope that some people listening to this will check out your chairs.
Oh, right.
I, I mean, it's, these sorts of things. I'm not telling people to go buy this or buy that, but I think it's helpful to meet the person behind it and get a sense of who you are and what you're about and what motivates you to do what you do. And I think that's the best possible advertisement. So I hope that people who can afford it. I had a friend I was telling about this, and he was like, "Well, I don't know. I looked at the website and they describe the chairs as affordable, but they're like $400." And I was like, "Dude, how many visits to a chiropractor or a surgeon will $400 cover?" You know, it's
No,
like,
and I rankle with that too. So um now we have one that we're selling for $300. We're doing everything we can to kind of, find some way to bring active sitting to everybody.
yeah.
Um
Well,
and
and as office chairs go, $400 isn't expensive. I've looked at them, and I have an or I had an Aeron chair that costs like $900 or something. Um,
those guys cranking out Aeron chairs are not in it for you.
they're not in it for the Aerons. Yeah. All right. Well, I will link to your TEDx talk and to your website, and I hope people will come and
Well,
visit
it's
you.
been
And
swell. I just love these kind of free-ranging conversations, and I love your book. Civilized to Death is really it's a terrific read.
thank you.
It's not easy to cover that much ground with authority.
I faked most of it.
You fooled me the whole time.
Great.